Zoom. Welcome to, I'd say all of you, but that might be optimistic, but thank you for being here. I call it an incomplete history because even though I have a master's degree in literature, I never really studied the dystopian genre. It's more, this is kind of through my own research into the genre. I hope for those here, this could give you a possible reading list too, of some of the books in the canon. But so first of all, just some of the elements of the dystopian genre. Typically, dystopias take place sometime in a imagined future. There usually is some overarching force that controls most aspects of living. One of the classic dystopians that I read before I even knew it was a dystopian is 1984. And you have Big Brother and government has kind of totalitarian control through surveillance and whatnot of really controlling how people live their lives. But typically there's some force. Often that force is presenting itself though as though it's maintaining a utopia. They kind of present it in a way saying this is necessary. It's necessary that we live this way. Usually though, there's a protagonist who has some kind of an awakening to like, this isn't right. People shouldn't be living this way. This shouldn't be existence. Oftentimes, but not always, the characters it'll actually be love or some kind of spark of human connection that makes them realize that whatever the controlling force is wrong. And in dystopias, usually that protagonist then works to try to subvert or overcome the overarching force. And sadly, in most dystopias, the hero fails. By the end of the novel, the world is still the way it is. And either that character has been reconditioned to live in the world again, like Winston from 1984, or they're deceased or what have you, but they typically fail in their attempts to overthrow the overarching force. I do like that dystopian literature is kind of overt in its messaging. Usually they are trying to take some aspect of our world and then turn the volume way up on it. So, I mean, the best dystopians make you think in terms of how we are living now, or they even serve as a warning in terms of, do we want our future to eventually look like this? How could we avoid that? So there's a futurism to dystopias, but it's really the best ones, at least, are with a concern for the present. So often, at least for me, this was my first exposure to dystopian literature was Orwell's 1984. I talked about that a little bit with Big Brother, etc. I mean, even this one is so well known. Big Brother has become kind of the part of the popular nomenclature. I mean, most people know when you talk about Big Brother, you're being surveilled or watched in some kind of way, controlled by a government. And for the longest time, because of its popularity, I thought 1984 was also the first dystopian novel. I was mistaken, but it's definitely one of the more well-known ones. And that was published in 1949. Another one, and this is my favorite dystopian novel, Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, obviously published a little bit after Orwell's book, but still a great read. And if you're interested in books and the importance of books, etc., Bradbury does an incredible job in this book. Have you read Fahrenheit 451? Is that a favorite for you as well? Yeah. And this as was mentioned, my book, Rules of Order, came out from Montag Press. And if you recall, the hero of Fahrenheit 451 is Guy Montag, so they named their press after him. Another one, again, we're getting farther as far as getting into the source, or where was the first dystopian book, but we got A Clockwork Orange by Burgess. Became a movie, actually, a movie that Burgess actually did not care for. He warmed up to it later, but he thought that the movie was kind of doing the very thing that his characters were caught up in, which was glorifying violence. But in Clockwork Orange, he is kind of looking at his modern world. He sees teenagers kind of reckless, without guides, desensitized, violent, etc. So he sets a future world in which teenagers are acting the way he's seen, but in a more, he turns the volume way up on it. Of course, we have Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, published in 1985. This has become a series, I believe, on Netflix. And again, this one, thinking about published in 1985, she was already seeing in 1985 the seeds of what we see going on now, and Supreme Court taking away, the right to abortion, et cetera, women's rights, et cetera. She was seeing this in 1985, and she wrote about that in that book. Then so we find one that is actually published before Orwell's book, 1932, Brave New World comes out. Huxley, when 1984 came out, Orwell sent Huxley a copy of it, and Huxley wrote it, and there's kind of a famous letter where he's like, this was very entertaining. However, I think I got it right in Brave New World. Like, I think because Brave New World, it has a government that's kind of in charge, but the way it's so subtle, because the populace is largely drugged. They take a drug, soma, all the time, which kind of keeps them perpetually happy. And also the government is breeding people for work. So they actually have birthing centers, and it's not particularly flattering names, but I remember one, like they were called semi-morons. And they're bred to do kind of meaningless, mind-numbing work, but they are immune to the mind-numbing effects of it because they're bred not to get bored. Their brain is made small enough that they don't get bored, and they can't do anything more complicated. But that's part of the government's idea of utopia, is we will just breed people for certain kinds of work. And there are alphas and people who have more thoughts, more complicated brains, and those are the ones who tend to take soma, the drug, to keep themselves happy, because there is an underlying kind of depressiveness even to this perfect world that they are supposedly in. So for the longest time after reading it, I thought Brave New World was the first. But then we get what I thought was the first, 1924, Yevgeny Zamyatin publishes this in Russia. It's a pretty wild novel. There's a little description of it here. It's also funny that both Huxley and Orwell accuse each other of ripping off the plot to We. But it says here, We, the exhilarating dystopian novel that inspired George Orwell's 1984 and a precursor to the work of Philip K. Dick and Stanislaw Lem, and foreshadowed the worst excesses of Soviet Russia. The novel describes a world of harmony and conformity within a united totalitarian state. This story of the 30th century is set in the one state, a society where all live for the collective good and individual freedom does not exist. The novel takes the form of the diary of state mathematician D503, who, to his shock, experiences the most disruptive emotion imaginable, love for another human being. We is the classic dystopian novel and was the forerunner of works such as George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. It was suppressed for many years in Russia and remains a resounding cry for individual freedom, yet is also a powerful, exciting, and vivid work of science fiction. So if you haven't checked out We yet, I would highly recommend that as a book to check out. But then I found it through research, and I couldn't believe who wrote the first dystopian novel. It's called The Iron Heel, published in 1907, published by an American writer. Anybody know who wrote The Iron Heel? What's that? No, I was surprised. I was surprised because he's, in my mind, better known for nature writing like White Fang and Call of the Wild. But Jack London had it's worth checking out. He has such a robust publishing list. He published a lot of novels and had a keen interest in science fiction. So yes, The Iron Heel, I did read this. It's a very interesting read. Another one that he wrote, published in 1915, called The Scarlet Plague. And interestingly, it is about a pandemic that takes place somewhere around the same time that our pandemic started. Different kind of thing. People would typically, if they got the virus, their skin would turn red and they would die in a very short time, but there were some survivors. And the story is actually this grandfather with his grandchildren on the shore. The grandchildren don't know anything about the times before the plague. So they're living kind of this feral existence where they're collecting crabs out of the ocean. And they're kind of tolerating grandpa, who's telling these stories of what it used to be like. And he seems to be kind of whimsically missing those times. But as you're reading it, you're almost wondering, is Jack London saying there was something wrong with those times too? Because London brings up a lot the disparities between the upper class and the lower class, et cetera. And you get the sense that this post-plague world doesn't really have classes. Everybody's kind of equal. And Jack London was a fairly big socialist as well, in his political leanings. So another one and the Scarlet Plague is fairly short. I found it an interesting read. Then, of course, before you had dystopians, you had the very first utopian, written in 1516 by Thomas More, called Utopia. Sir Thomas More was the first person to write of a utopia, a word used to describe a perfect imaginary world. More's book imagines a complex, self-contained community set on an island in which people share a common culture and way of life. He coined the word utopia from the Greek utopos, meaning no place or nowhere. It was a pun. The almost identical Greek word utopos means a good place. So at the very heart of the word is a vital question. Can a perfect world ever be realized? It is unclear as to whether the book is a serious projection of a better way of life or a satire that gave More a platform from which to discuss the chaos of European politics. That one I have not read. This one I have. This is another utopian work, B.F. Skinner's Walden 2. Skinner is a basic with psychology hates this perfect world, and because there are these reporters and outsiders who are walking around this community that he kind of explained, realizes that he can never truly enjoy his creation because he still carries a lot of that he's really proud of what he's done, and yet pride is something that they've done away with in the community itself. The people who live in this world that he's created are perfectly happy and aren't bothered with pride, and yet he can tell as he's kind of taking these people on tour, it's like, I'll never fit in here. I still carry the values of that world that I was raised in. That's definitely an interesting read as well. Another book here, American Utopias. There was, especially in the late 20s and 30s, there was an effort to try to create utopian societies. So it says here, the history of people trying to create utopian micro societies in America is pretty interesting too. And that goes all the way into like even hippie communes and whatnot. But definitely in the 30s, there were very serious intellectual people who were trying to create these perfect environments for people to live in. More often than not, they failed. They did not continue. Right. Yeah, but this book, it's kind of fascinating. It goes through a bunch of the societies and what happened to them. And again, a lot of these societies put a lot of power in the person who founded it, so they can borderline on cults as well. And then there can be a lot of abuse from that. But that's an interesting read. So it is the American Utopias, the history of famous attempts to establish utopian societies in the United States. All right. Well, that is the presentation on dystopian history. That's why I call it an incomplete history. There are thousands and thousands of dystopian books. It definitely has become, for good or for bad, it has become a very popular young adult genre. I don't necessarily know, again, that, like I said, I think the best dystopias show us a little something about ourselves. And I think sometimes the young adult dystopias are just kind of world building. It just gives them an excuse to set something in the future. But I don't know that there's always the depth there to really study and say, what is this saying about ourselves? How is this a reflection of how we're currently living? But that's what I attempted to do. And I want to read a little bit of my novel that just came out, Rules of Order. Well, it came out last summer in August. I'll tell you a little, I'll give you a little bit of an overview, and then I'll read some from the first chapter. Rules of Order tells the story of Harvey Crow, a community activist who lives in what could be the last remaining high-rise building in a wrecked city. Cracks in the ground floor apartments are appearing exponentially. The building's structural strength can't possibly hold the load it bears. Crow works to inform tenants on the upper floors that the weight of their possessions could bring the entire building down. Working with the Anti-Collapse Trust, Crow encounters obstacles to his message, including indifferent tenants, his self-doubt, hostile security guards, and a co-op board headed by the corrupt Chairman Burke. Even as Crow makes meaningful alliances with other influential tenants, he can feel the way they are working against a ticking clock. With time running out, Crow and his militant colleague Dagmar carry out a desperate plan to save what might be the city's last habitable space. The book begins with something having woken Harvey from his sleep. So I'll read some of chapter 1 for you. Harvey Crow blinked his eyes open into the dim light of his bedroom. More often than not, it was nightmares that woke him lately, prophetic hallucinations of the impending collapse. Black and white visions from his subconscious haunted his deepest sleep. They were images he fought to keep at bay during his waking hours. If he didn't, they could leave him nearly paralyzed for hours. In the dreams, the towering building he lived in, well, they all lived in, stood momentarily, but then, as if pressed from above by a giant invisible hand, it began to disintegrate. The unseen palm pushed as though on a collapsible telescope, but with such determined force as to drive the lenses shattering into each other. Plumes of debris spread outward from random floors like the rings of a planet, and then the building was gone. Nothing but dust and death dissolving into the gray, lifeless landscape around it. But he recalled no such dream. He wasn't entangled in chilled, sweat-soaked sheets. His heartbeat and breathing were normal. None of the metallic taste of adrenaline coated the inside of his mouth. No, something else had woken him. The building's pipes hummed in the walls and echoed with the sound of water and waste moving up and down the multitude of copper and PVC lengths. A loud groan signaled what the building's board of directors had come to call a settling sequence. Harmless, they said, not unlike when people get older and lose height, a natural consequence of aging. Good bones, they said. The building has good bones. The thump and churn of water in the pipes, the haunted moans of the building settling, his sleep had been soundtracked by them for so long that he knew that's not what had awoken him. It couldn't have been. They were like white noise to him. Even distant shouting in the hallway or the screams of an assault hardly made him stir, not for indifference, but for familiarity. On his wall, a reflection from the dim nightlight's glow highlighted the reinforcing epoxy that filled a 5-foot-long crack in the concrete. He could see where the fissure was growing several inches past the epoxy's reach. Cracks had become so epidemic that for the last 6 months, members of the maintenance crew could be seen lugging huge caulking guns and pounding on the doors of the lower floors. The expense had become enough for the board to implement an epoxy tithe. The new tax fell on tenants who lived on the 20th floor and lower. Reassuring letters from the board explained that more than a filler, the epoxy, once fully cured, was stronger than the concrete, like that of a healed broken bone. Crow's mother had worked as a nurse in the building's sub-level infirmary. She'd told him that the idea of a fractured bone healing stronger than before was just a myth. It's true, she'd said, that a cuff of strong new bone forms around the break site to protect it. So for a short time, the fracture is stronger, but the cuff goes away over time, and then you just get regular old bone. He smiled into the darkness, remembering this. His mother had always taken the time to explain the world to him. As an only child, he was treated by his mother and father almost as a third adult in their home, even from a young age. They didn't talk in code around him, and when he asked questions, they gave honest answers. Being raised that way had not made for an easy childhood when his school years started. To him, his peers lacked curiosity and seemed woefully uninformed. To them, he was a know-it-all and the teacher's pet. His mind went to Dagmar, and he wondered what she would have thought of him in his school days. She probably would have bullied him too. And now somehow they were aligned as members of a group set on saving the fate of the building. She was by far the most militant member with ideas that scared him. One of Dagmar's experts had looked into the claims about the epoxy, and they too were dishonest, he determined. More damn lies from the board, Dagmar had said, throwing a knife that stuck into the baseboard of Crow's kitchen. He winced at the memory of her anger, her combat boots, her sneer, her lips, her passion, her lithe body. Stop it, he thought. Her language more and more suggested that drastic measures were needed, even if it meant violence. He couldn't let his loneliness keep him from seeing the danger she could be to the cause. She could ruin everything if he let his guard down. Waiting for the other shoe to drop, that's all this is, she'd hissed, except it won't be a shoe. Sparked by an impulse, a desire for words, something in the face of Dagmar's ominous ranting, Crow had told her the history of the old saying. What saying? Waiting for the other shoe to drop, he said. In tenement buildings in New York, the construction was so shoddy people could hear the slightest movements of their neighbors. Her face registered little interest. Well, the bedrooms were built one above the other. So? Well, at night, he continued, people would sit on the edge of their beds unlacing their shoes. Removing one, they'd let it drop to the floor, startling awake their neighbor below. He studied her short spiked hair, wondering if it could puncture his palm. Dagmar bent forward to retrieve her knife from the baseboard. Are you listening? He asked. Yes, she said, taking her seat again. She ran the tip of her blade under a fingernail. Just hurry up with your story. Well, that's it. The neighbor below would lie awake, staring up at the darkened ceiling, unable to go back to sleep, and waiting for the other shoe to drop. I get it, she said. Fascinating, Crow. He looked at the floor, then up at her again. Well, it's a metaphor, too. The way we are all connected, the way our thoughtless actions can ripple into the lives of others, the way, that's your problem, she'd said, standing and sheathing her knife. I mean, you're good with words, your newsletter, talking to people on the upper floors, it's a gift. But your belief in words feels naive. Stories, speeches, electronic posts, sometimes they aren't enough. She walked to his door, opened it, and before it fully closed behind her, said, "And when their usefulness has ended, then it's time for action." The last he saw of her was of the sheath strapped to her belt. The sound of the latch clicking into the strike plate echoed in the room long after she'd left, as though some bigger door had closed. Crow threw off his blanket and turned on his lamp. He sat on his bed in the yellowed light. He thought of Dagmar more than he wanted to. She was the closest thing to female companionship he'd known in years. Proximity to her had grown into fondness, even if she was different from him, angry and fierce. He would force himself to remember that she was the de facto leader of the Anti-Collapse Trust, or ACT, and the cause worked best if he kept his thoughts for her professional. Plus, he was going to have to keep his wits around her if he was going to be able to temper her rage. Startling him, the voices of the building's superintendent and his wife echoed in a nearby vent. He shook his head, guessing that maybe it was their bickering that had woken him. By some cruel twist of ductwork, his bedroom vent was like a phone receiver eavesdropping on their heated exchanges in the basement-level apartment that they occupied together. "Anya, that's it. I'm putting tape down the middle of the living room," the super yelled up through the vent's tinny resonance. "The kitchen and bathroom will be neutral territory. Otherwise, you stay on your side." Crow rolled his eyes. It sounded like something from a bad comedy he'd once seen. "I hate you," she yelled back. "All you've ever done is lie to me. From the beginning, you are the worst thing that ever happened to me. Venom, that's all you have, woman. You're like a snake." Crow went to his bathroom. Standing in front of the mirror, propping himself with his palms against the edge of the sink, he examined his bloodshot eyes and ashen skin. He was too young for so much gray hair. How long had it been since he'd had a full night's sleep, eaten a decent meal, did anything other than worry about the fate of the building? Days had become years, and yet what, if anything, had changed? Most tenants carried on as though nothing were happening. He grabbed a towel from the metal rack that dangled from loose drywall anchors. Back in the bedroom, he covered the vent with the towel, muffling the arguing coming from the super's apartment. He fell into bed again, feeling the exhaustion of another fruitless day on the upper floors, knocking on doors, imploring tenants to consider the weight of their things. There were rumors of new hot tubs, gas fireplaces with stone mantles, and new deep freezers. Few cared to listen to him. Some slammed their doors. Others opened their doors only as wide as their chain locks would allow. They admitted to having heard the rumors and load warnings too, but what could be done? Others confronted him. They'd earned their money, and it was their right to spend it however they wanted. They didn't want to hear about the size of the cracks in the lower level apartments. Air pockets, they countered, when he explained that one part of the building had sunk 2 inches in 6 years. Buildings settle into soft soil. It's perfectly natural. It was as though they had memorized the board's letters of assurance. Predictions of a complete building collapse made most laugh or shake their heads. Doom and gloom, they said, pointing out their frosted windows towards the hazy shadow of the building's buttressing exoskeleton. They spoke confidently of the board's plan to install 20 new steel pilings to brace the foundation. For most of the day, the pilings were the biggest counterargument he heard. 20 new steel pilings. The board planned to move on Operation Steel in the next few weeks. After that, there would be nothing to worry about, they said. Sometimes, standing in a tenant's doorway, Crow felt even himself being convinced of the foresight and wisdom of the board. He tried to counter with the arguments that he and Dagmar had laid out. The foundation had never been constructed for so many residents, their excessive belongings, or the addition of more floors. His arguments felt worn and out of date compared to the progressive talk of the steel pilings. A handful of tenants did listen and admitted their doubts about the pilings or anything to do with the board's promises. "I don't trust Burke," they said of the board's chairman. Crow gave such tenants his name and his phone number in addition to his pamphlets, which also included his contact information. He snapped open his dozing eyes to a blaring sound. After a moment, the telephone rang a second time. His thoughts immediately went to his parents, something wrong with his mother or father. Then, as he always did, he remembered that they had both passed away 2 years ago. A gas line had fractured in their apartment, asphyxiating both of them in their sleep. The board's tenant liaison member had called him with the news and condolences, naming it an unfortunate and unforeseeable accident. Dagmar had approached him then, explaining that the building had experienced a load-related shift that had cracked the gas line. "Your parents are dead due to negligence and greed-induced blindness," she had said to him. Then she'd said more, all of it related to the inevitable collapse of the building. For Crow, their meeting was an awakening. He quit his job writing marketing copy for Just Like Water, and soon after joined ACT and their efforts to save the building. As his parents' only child, he was the beneficiary of a meager life insurance policy that allowed him to eke out a subsistence living while messaging for the cause. He picked up the ringing phone receiver. Even its lightness felt like a brick in his hand. "Hello?" For a moment, he only heard labored breathing coming through the small speaker against his ear. Then, "Can you help me?" a voice asked, old and raspy. "What?" "I fell trying to get water. I can't get off the floor." Crow sat up. "Why are you calling me?" "Your number was on a flyer under my door." He rubbed his itchy eyes. "We're just trying to inform tenants. Can you help me?" Crow lingered for a moment with the cold of the phone against his ear. "I'm tired. Isn't there anybody else you could call?" The voice sounded ready to crack into sobbing. "I don't have anybody else. Just my aide, but she won't come again for 2 days. I'd call her, but the agency doesn't share the aide's phone numbers." He explained that the agency line itself went directly to an automated answering service. Crow listened to his stomach rumbling from having skipped both lunch and dinner. "It's okay," the voice said. "I'll be okay." "No," Crow said. "I'll come. What apartment?" The man gave him a room number 9 floors above him. He exhaled. His thighs ached from the flights he'd been up and down earlier in the day. "Just give me a few minutes." The deadened voices of the super and his wife continued their endless squabbling under the towel. "I'll slide the key under the door," the voice said. Crow imagined the frail body belonging to the voice lying on a doormat, shivering, waiting for his arrival. "I'm on my way," he said, hanging up. He quickly dressed and stepped out into the flickering dim light of the hallway. The smell of cooked cabbage filled his nostrils. In the darker sections where the sconces were burned out, he felt his hand along the wall. Peeling paint fell to the floor in his wake. He couldn't remember how many work orders he'd sent to the maintenance department regarding the lighting on his floor. Each request was met with a reminder that the board had made Operation Epoxy a priority over all other maintenance issues, after which his request would be addressed in the order in which it was received. Crow pressed his shoulder into the rusty fire door at the end of the hallway that led into the stairwell. Because they'd stopped working years ago, the lock sets and latch sets had been removed. The door swung open easily and then closed itself again behind him. He started up the stairwell, counting the floors as he went, his legs burning. At least there were no security gates on the lower landings to deal with. When he found and opened the door to the old man's apartment, Crow spotted him with the doormat draped over his shivering torso, his body a yellowish hue, some sickness wicking to the surface. "You're here," he murmured as Crow picked him up and carried him through the hardly furnished living room to the bedroom. His thin arms wrapped around Crow's neck, the skin of his forearms dry and cold. Crow's fingers slipped into the pockets between the old man's ribs. He couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. "Thank you," he whispered. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Crow set him on the rickety bed and pulled the blankets up over him. Patchy sprouting of a beard grew from his sallow cheeks, the crown of his head overgrown with a thinned shock of white, greasy hair. He smiled weakly. I'm a sight, aren't I? Crow touched the old man's frail shoulder. You're fine. You're just fine. He smiled, looking into the pale blue eyes. Let me get you that water. He stayed at the faucet with one of the two glasses that he'd found in the cupboard, dumping out the cloudy water again and again. He let the faucet run for a minute and was able to get a glassful that was only slightly discolored. He handed the glass to the old man, who drank it dry. More? No, this is good. Crow took the glass, filled it again, and set it on the bedside table, in case you get thirsty later. The old man thanked him, covering his hand over his yellowing teeth. Reaching up, he smoothed his fingers over his head in an attempt to press his wild hair into place. Crow watched his self-consciousness. What does your aide even do? She checks my medications, takes vitals. It's all I can afford. How do you? I have a walker, he said, pointing to it in the corner. I was just stubborn. I wanted to see if I could get to the kitchen and back on my own. Stupid, really. Just a man wants a little dignity sometimes at this age. Something. He said he wouldn't do it again. Walker or no, I get dizzy if I stand too long. Crow crossed his arms. You have no family? He shook his head. Never married, never had children. Crow wondered if he was getting a preview of his own old age. I'll be right back. Are you sleepy? The old man shook his head. No, I'll be up for a while yet. Crow descended back to his apartment and returned 15 minutes later. Taking a pot filled with warm water from the old man's kitchen, he went back into the bedroom and draped a towel around his neck and shoulders. Barbershop treatment, he said. The old man smiled. I'm game. Working carefully, Crow used a dish rag to wet the white hair and then lathered it lightly with shampoo before rinsing it out with the rag. Pulling strands up between his fingers and snipping with scissors, he took 2 inches off and then combed the hair back over the age-spotted scalp. When he finished, he collected 2 handfuls of the trimmings like thatch and dropped them fluttering into the room's garbage can. Let me see the mirror. Crow smiled. Hold on, I'm not finished yet. He sprayed shaving cream into his palm and then spread it over the cheeks, under the nose, and over the chin. Soon after, he began to shave him slowly and carefully with a disposable razor, swishing it clean in the pot of water after each stroke. I'm Leo. My name is Leo. He smiled. Harvey Crow. It's a pleasure to meet you, Leo. He lifted the towel from his thin shoulders and rubbed away the residue of the shaving cream. Can you refill that pot with warm water? Leo asked. He nodded. When he returned from the kitchen, Leo was looking at himself in the handheld mirror Crow had brought up with him. Well, I look okay. You do indeed. Leo put the dish rag into the warm water and then rubbed it into each of his armpits and across his chest, protruding with ribs. I feel ready. Leo asked that Crow go into the bathroom for his toothbrush and dental powder. When he did, he found that the bristles of the brush were all nearly flat. After he finished running the nub of the brush over his teeth, Leo smiled. I have one more favor to ask of you, if I may. He asked Crow to go to his closet and retrieve a suit of clothes. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, slowly working his swollen fingers through the task of buttoning a dress shirt. He asked that Crow help him with the topmost button. Tucking the shirt into his pants, he then jump roped a tie over the back of his neck and began the task of tying it. Crow helped him cinch the knot up snug just under the bump of his Adam's apple. Standing steadily, he put his arms back and let Crow slide the sleeves of the threadbare jacket up and over his hands to the shoulders. Ah, a valet. Yes, my lord, Crow said, smiling. He walked around to the front of him. I don't know, Leo. Looking like you do, you might find a wife yet. Leo laughed and asked him to walk near him as he made his way to the bathroom. Are you sure? He nodded. I feel 20 years younger, he said. though he gripped Crow's arm for support. Standing in front of the mirror, the old man admired himself, smoothing his hand back over his fresh haircut. Yes, this is how a gentleman should look. Crow took him by the elbow and led him back into the bedroom and then to the bed. Leo pulled up the comforter and then lay on top of it. Do you want me to put your clothes away? He shook his head. I'll be fine. I'd like to stay this way for a while. He laughed. In the space of an hour, you've seen me wear an entry rug and now my best suit. I prefer this look, Crow said as he gathered the toiletries. I'm going to be back again to check on you tomorrow, okay? Sleep well, Leo. I believe I will. And thank you for everything. Crow reached down and squeezed his knobby hand. Leo squeezed back as best he could. Returning to his apartment, Crow put everything back into its place. The memory of Leo's grateful face kept a smile on his own. It had turned out to be a good night. He could feel the wisps of hair between his fingers as though they were still there. Pulling up his blankets, he shut off his bedside lamp and closed his eyes. Tonight he would sleep, he was sure of it. Oh, thank you. I don't know if we do a Q&A, if there are any questions regarding either the reading or the presentation. We can give it a shot. I don't know if I have copies of it myself, if you're interested.
Maybe for the guy on Zoom. I was just asking if the book is going to be available here at the Grand Traverse Library.
As far as acquisitions, I'm not sure. I have copies of it for sale if you're interested in one. I sell them for 10 and you get a signed one if you're interested.
Yeah, I have a question. So a lot of the books that you listed are books that are often banned. Do you think that that's kind of a trend? Like dystopian novels are often banned more often than, say, just a regular normal book?
I think because of that overt messaging that sometimes they're seen as dangerous, ideas are seen as dangerous. And I do think, I don't know, I remember in grad school reading novels and, we'd for hours sit and discuss what the book might be about, but you were just kind of ferreting out these, and it was all kind of still like, is this really what the author meant? And then with the dystopians, it's pretty plain what they're trying to express. And I like them for that. And I do think that's, I teach Fahrenheit 451 in my literature class, and to be able, the students can talk very openly, where sometimes I think literature is kind of so ambiguous in what it's trying to say that it all depends on one person, the professor, to explain, well, here's what so-and-so meant. Or I get a lot more engagement with the dystopian novels with students. And I think that's where some parties would see them as dangerous, is they're so blatant in their message, what they're trying to show us.
I don't remember if you said this or not, but do you have a favorite dystopian novel?
Fahrenheit 451 for sure. Yeah. And I just love Bradbury's style. And I was reading Fahrenheit 451 while writing Rules of Order. And I'm typically not a whole lot of similes, but Bradbury is all kinds of similes. And I saw as I'm reading, it's like, there's a lot of similes in my book. So I think I was being influenced by his style there too. But I just think, Bradbury can tell a story in such a powerful way. 1984 sometimes gets a little long in the tooth for me as a dystopian. It is a big, thick book, and the last third of which is, I don't know. I think what happens to Winston is kind of disappointing for an ending to the book. But yeah, for sure, Fahrenheit. But Brave New World is up there too. Do we still have our Zoom person? Or did they go away? Okay, I don't know if they have any question.
What book are you reading right now? What was the last book you read?
I'm reading, we just got, and I think this is important too, we just in Midland got a bookstore again. We have a Barnes and Noble, but as far as an independent bookstore, we just got one in Midland called Bookmarks, which just opened, I think, importantly too, in our downtown. we used to have a bookstore called Sleepy Hollow, but it was off, obviously as a bookstore owner, you're trying to have as low of rent as possible, but then it often puts you in a part of town where there's less traffic, people are less inclined to go there, so it's kind of a catch-22. So yes, I've got Andre Dubus, collection of his short stories, and I've just started reading that. So not dystopian at all, but I read Dubus stuff and I was like, why even bother to write? Like, if these stories exist, that's all the world needs. He's just an incredible writer.
I was just, the last dystopian book that I read, it actually is a series, Nikki Huntsman Smith, What Befalls a Child. I'm not sure what the whole series is called, but there's 5 oh, I didn't want to do that. Well, anyway, oh, stop. Anyway, but it's a 5-book series, and it's been compared to The Stand because it's after a pandemic.
All right.
And so what happens, how the people deal with that, and so actually I read or listened to these first. And then because I was so interested in this, I am now listening to The Stand, which I had not read before.
Okay.
But
That's King, right?
yeah, and that's Stephen King, which I have not read a lot of his
No, they're
books, but like I said, the fact that this book was being compared to that made me interested in listening to that.
there are so many dystopian books now, and I do wonder, is it because they're lucrative, like people buy them, or why do people want to read them? I think we're more worried about the world now in a way. And so I don't know what dystopian teaches us other than what we have here is a gift.
We see a lot of this stuff coming down the pike.
Right.
Right. And so we're trying to work through, is this really where we're heading, or what can we do so that we don't head in that direction? Or like The Handmaid's Tale, like for us as women, like we're kind of in it, or we see that there are people trying to drive us toward that.
Exactly. Yeah, so again, it goes back to that argument, though. I think it's the messaging, the blatant, it's not to be ferreted out. It's pretty obvious what the author is trying to say.
But they get you thinking about it, and it gets you thinking about like, why are why is this good for some people, but not good in general for all of us?
Right.
So some people benefit from some of these things and other people really don't. And is that what we want?
Well, I remember I was looking at Rules of Order on Amazon, and it said the sales rank, but it also says like it was ranked 2,916 out of dystopian novels. So there's a lot
Oh yeah.
of dystopian books, which I would say probably 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there weren't. It really has exploded as a genre, and it's all over in movies. And yeah, I wonder if the pendulum will swing the other way. I'm not sure. Everybody is trying to come up with the next Hunger Games or what have you. There's money to be made in that. And I do think there's some, I know Hunger Games is considered young adult. I do think there's at least something in terms of class. All the districts are kind of based on money. And obviously the haves control everything, and the have-nots become fodder for their entertainment in the Hunger Games. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, it's okay too.
Well, I could say, because I also read a lot of fantasy, Lord of the Rings, all that kind of thing. Of course, nobody can really compare with Lord of the Rings, but I find that like a lot of the modern fantasy coming out now is kind of boring to me, because in fantasy, as opposed to science fiction, everything is like just solved with a magic wand or a ring or a spell or a potion or whatever without a whole lot of thought or background into like how does any of this work. Whereas in science fiction, there's a serious effort to give you a little bit of background about how this might have happened and how you might fix it. And, you know, there's
Right.
some thought and some science and some effort put into it rather than just, oh, well, we'll just say these words and that'll fix the whole thing. You know, the whole problem will just disappear, you know?
Right, right. Tolkien too was, he, like, the Lord of the Rings to him was some of his concern for industrialization. Like the Shire, to him was an ideal society, you know, almost a utopia.
Yeah, he put a lot of work and effort. I mean, that was real. What was the term you used? The building, the
World building,
world building?
right?
I mean, he really built a world, including languages and geography and, you know, and people with different backgrounds. And I mean, so there was a lot of thought and effort put into that, similar to what I was saying about science fiction. And that's why I say like modern fantasy stuff kind of really doesn't compare because they're not making that effort to make a real list. I mean, Hunger Games maybe a little bit, you know, some of the better ones, you know, do, but you know, I lose my patience with something that's just too simplistic.
I think fantasy too is hard because the tropes are, it's so easy to be like, to write a Lord of the Rings ripoff. Right. That's what I was told. I heard a story that Tolkien first wrote and created the Elvish language. That's how he started. And then he said, well, a language can't exist without a world. Right. And another fascinating thing is reading the letters between him and C.S. Lewis, because they were both, you know, right. Oh, I think Lewis too believed like there was a world couldn't function without, he thought the Christian mythos was the, so then of course you have the lion who was killed, but he returns, etc.
Okay, so we have a couple questions.
Oh, okay.
So Jeanette, can you discuss the difference and the overlap between dystopian and post-apocalyptic literature?
No. I can try. I think most post-apocalyptic literature is dystopian in some kind of way, because again, it's this fear that we carry, right? That there are these weapons in the world that can destroy the world 20 times over. I've heard even 100 times over the nuclear, you know, and they're in silos. As we're in this room, we have to live with this fact. Progress got us here. Is it really progress just because we can make it? Should we make it? So I think most post-apocalyptic literature is dystopian, but not all dystopians are post-apocalyptic. You know, there's not an apocalypse. There's an apocalypse waiting to happen in Rules of Order with the collapse of the building, but it's not post-apocalyptic. So that's the best answer I could come up with. Good question.
And then, do you plan to write any more dystopian fiction, or do you have any plans to write post-apocalyptic books?
Right. I haven't written. I wrote Rules of Order. I started it in the spring of 2020. Something happened in the spring of 2020. And I had suddenly a lot of time on my hands. So I wrote Rules of Order, the first draft, in 5 weeks. Because I was sitting on my couch waiting for student emails to come in. We'd been sent home. My students, like a lot of us, were literally shutting down. They didn't, they were at a point where like, who cares about finishing some English class? The world's ending anyway. We're in this pandemic. So I had a lot of time on my hands. So what I thought I was going to write over the course of the summer, I wrote in 5 weeks and then spent the summer rewriting it. Still had time on my hands in the fall. So I wrote 2 novels in 2020. So I wrote a Gothic horror novel that's also slated to be published by the same press that did Rules of Order. But since writing 2 novels back to back in 1 year, it's been tough to get the gumption to start anything else. But I don't know if the next would be, it would have to be, I really write whatever idea comes to me. And then if an idea comes to me, I spend a number of weeks first hoping that it'll go away. Because if it goes away, then it wasn't an idea worth pursuing. But if it's still nagging at me 2 or 3 weeks later, then I'll start.
Thank you.
And for the Zoom folks, Rules of Order is available on Amazon. If anybody is interested in, you would want to type in Rules of Order and then VANDE. Otherwise, you'll get Robert's Rules of Order, which is a book on parliamentarian procedure. Yeah. So I would appreciate any support on that one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.